My son didn't raise his voice when he said it, and that's why the words cut so deeply. Mom, you're not coming. My wife decided you're not family. It was a family cruise. I had paid for more than half of it. My suitcase was already by the door, my scarf folded on top the way I always did before leaving home. I stared at him, waiting for a correction. A laugh. Anything to tell me this was a mistake. But he said nothing. And in that silence, I understood the truth. He had allowed another woman to decide that his mother no longer belonged. In that moment, something unbearable settled in my chest. I wasn't just uninvited from a trip. I was erased from my own family. How do you look at the woman who raised you and decide she's optional? If you want to hear my story until the end, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. My name is Margaret. I am 68 years old, and I raised my son alone. His father left when our boy was still small enough to fall asleep on my chest during late movies, his fist curled in my sweater like an anchor. After that, there was no safety net. No second income. No one to split the fear with when rent was due or the car made a new sound I couldn't afford to ignore. I worked my entire life so my son would never feel that fear. I cleaned offices at night and worked a front desk job during the day. I packed lunches that smelled like apples and soap because I washed my hands too often. I paid for braces, school trips, college applications, and the quiet emergencies that never show up on paper. I never called it sacrifice. It was simply motherhood. I was the one who showed up. To parent-teacher meetings. To late-night phone calls. To the hospital waiting room when he broke his wrist and tried not to cry because he thought men weren't supposed to. I taught him how to open a bank account, how to read a lease, how to shake a hand and look someone in the eye. I taught him that family was not something you used, it was something you protected. For many years, I believed he understood that. Then he met his wife. At first, I told myself I was imagining the change. She was polite, efficient, careful with her words. She smiled without warmth and spoke as if everything was a negotiation already halfway decided. I told myself it was just adjustment. That I needed to give them space. They were young. They were building something. And I was proud that he had chosen a life. But over time, I noticed a pattern. I was still the one they came to when money was tight. Still the one who watched their dog, paid a utility bill, or covered a deposit when something unexpected happened. I was useful. Reliable. Quiet. And slowly, without any announcement, I became invisible in every other way. Plans were made without asking me. Decisions were shared after they were final. I learned important news the same way strangers did, through social media, smiling photos, captions about family, where my absence went unexplained. They were my son and his wife. A couple who grew comfortable with my support but impatient with my presence. And when the moment of real choice finally came, my son didn't choose his mother. He chose the version of family where I no longer had a place. The first real crack didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It arrived quietly, wrapped in polite words, the kind that leave no mark on the skin but bruise much deeper. We were in her kitchen that afternoon. The dishwasher was running, steady and dull, filling the pauses between sentences. Sunlight came through the window in narrow stripes, landing on the counter where I stood drying dishes. I had brought my own mug again, the heavy one with the chipped rim, because it fit my hand the way theirs never did. She watched me for a moment before she spoke. "You interfere too much," she said. Her voice was even. Measured. Almost rehearsed. Then she added, "We have our own family now." My son was standing nearby, leaning against the counter, scrolling through his phone. I waited for him to look up. To say something. To soften it, or at least acknowledge that his mother was standing right there. He didn't. The words hung in the air, heavier than the hum of the dishwasher. I remember the exact second they landed. I remember the way my fingers tightened around the towel, how my shoulders stiffened without me meaning them to. I told myself not to react. I told myself this was normal. Young couples needed space. Boundaries were healthy. I had read that somewhere. So I nodded. I folded the towel carefully. I said, of course, even though my throat felt dry and my chest felt too tight for such an easy answer. I left shortly after. No argument. No scene. At home, I sat alone at my kitchen table long after the sun went down. The overhead light flickered, just as it always had. The room smelled faintly of lavender cleaner and old paper. This was the table where my son once spilled ink on his homework, where I taught him fractions, where he signed his first college loan papers with shaking hands. Nothing in that room had changed. But something in me had. I replayed her words over and over. Not the tone, there was nothing to accuse there. It was the certainty that unsettled me. She hadn't said we need space. She hadn't said things are different now. She had said family, as if the word were something she could redefine at will. That was when I understood, this wasn't a moment. It was a declaration. After that day, the changes came in small, precise ways. Invitations stopped arriving naturally. I was informed instead of included. Holidays were discussed without me, then presented as finished plans. When I visited, conversations paused when I entered the room, then resumed with less detail. My presence became something to manage. And my son learned how to disappear while standing right beside me. When she spoke, he listened. When I spoke, he watched her face. There were evenings when I almost called him. When I almost asked why he never corrected her, why he let her speak about family as if I were an outdated attachment he had forgotten to remove. But I didn't. Because mothers are trained to wait. To hope. To believe that love will recognize itself in time. I didn't yet understand that silence is also a decision. And that long before the cruise. My son had already begun choosing. After that afternoon in her kitchen, the exclusion didn't arrive as one dramatic cut. It came like weather, small shifts that became a season before I noticed I was living inside it. Holidays were the first to change. The invitations didn't stop all at once, they simply moved out of my hands. I would hear about plans after they were settled, delivered in my son's careful voice as if he were reading from a script. We're keeping it small this year. We already promised her parents. It's easier if we don't do the whole rotation. Each sentence sounded reasonable. Together, they built a wall. On Thanksgiving, I roasted a small chicken for myself because a full turkey felt too hopeful. I set one plate anyway, then told myself it was for leftovers. I ate at my own table with the radio murmuring in the background, listening to other people's cheerful hosts give traffic updates and recipes, as if everyone had somewhere to be. News began reaching me the way it reaches acquaintances. Through photos. Through captions. Through other people's comments. I learned they had gone to a cabin when a coworker wrote, "You too deserve this." I learned he'd been promoted because his wife posted a picture of him holding a cake at the office. I learned they were thinking about moving because I saw a screenshot of a dream kitchen shared online. I would stare at those images too long, measuring the edges of their happiness, wondering where I had been in the conversation. Sometimes I typed a congratulatory message and deleted it. Sometimes I sent it anyway and received a single heart emoji in return. And yet, when money was needed, my phone rang. The calls always came with the same rhythm, a warm greeting, a brief update, then a pause where I could almost hear them choosing their words. A security deposit. A car repair. A surprise medical bill for the dog. Just until next month. We'll pay you right back. It's only temporary. My son's voice would soften on the word mom, like softness could turn a transaction into belonging. I transferred the money. I did it quickly, before my pride could speak. I told myself I was helping my child, the way I always had. I told myself love didn't keep score. But the imbalance became impossible to ignore. I was trusted with their problems, not their joy. Included in their emergencies, not their traditions. I was family in the ledger, not in the living room. When I offered to visit, there was always a reason to delay. This weekend's hectic. We're catching up on errands. Maybe next month when things calm down. When I did go over, the air felt managed. Her smile stayed on, but her eyes watched the time. Conversations shifted when I entered the room, then resumed with less detail, as if my presence required editing. I learned to speak in smaller sentences. I learned to ask fewer questions. Once, standing near their hallway mirror, I noticed a framed photo of the two of them labeled in neat lettering, "Our family." No room for anyone else. No awkward truth. Just a tidy definition. I remember how my hand hovered near it, then dropped back to my side as if touching the frame might confirm what I already feared. I asked my son one evening, gently, if I had done something to upset them. He let out a small laugh and said, "No, Mom. Don't be dramatic." Then he kissed my cheek, opened the door for me, and the subject evaporated. I walked to my car with my keys heavy in my palm, hearing the lock click behind me. I sat for a moment before turning the ignition, staring at my reflection in the windshield. I had raised a boy who once ran to me for comfort. Now I was being handled like a liability. Still, I stayed patient. Because I had been trained to endure. To wait. To believe that if I remained steady, I would eventually be welcomed back. I didn't understand yet that waiting was exactly what made me disappear. My birthday passed with a short text at 9:47 p.m. "Hope you had a good day." No call, no plan. I bought myself a slice of cake from the bakery and ate it on my porch, reminding myself that being alone was not the same as being unwanted. Mother's Day was worse because it arrived dressed as appreciation. A bouquet showed up with a printed card, "Thanks for everything." Later I saw a post, "Brunch with her mother," a caption about the women who raised us. My name wasn't there. I realized I'd been removed from their group chat after a cleanup. When I asked, my son said, "We're just simplifying things." Simplifying, as if I were clutter. The longer it went on, the clearer it became, I was being trained to accept less without complaint. And I nearly did. I nearly adapted to a life where I could be asked for help but not offered a seat, where family was a private word I no longer belonged to. I started keeping my calendar open on the counter, circling the days I heard from them. The blank weeks told their own story, in ink quiet, undeniable. Now. The cruise didn't begin as a conflict. It began as an idea passed back and forth so casually that I never thought to question my place in it. My son mentioned it one afternoon while standing in my kitchen, leaning against the counter the way he used to when he was younger. His wife followed later with links, photos, suggestions. She spoke about destinations and sunsets and formal dinners as if they already existed, as if we were all already standing there together. No one ever said, "You're invited." No one had to. I had spent my life assuming my place. When it came time to pay, I didn't hesitate. I covered more than half because there was a shortfall, because something always came up, because I could. I didn't make a show of it. I didn't expect gratitude. I told myself that money was replaceable, but time together wasn't. I began preparing with care. I washed clothes slowly, folding them neatly. I checked my passport twice, then once more before bed. I laid out my good shoes, the ones that didn't pinch, and my navy scarf, the one I wore when I wanted to feel steady. I placed my suitcase by the door days ahead of time. It felt important to be ready. In quiet moments, I let myself imagine the trip. Not grand scenes. Just simple ones. Sitting at a table together. Walking the deck in the evening. Feeling included without needing to ask. I didn't expect closeness. I only hoped for peace. 2 days before we were supposed to leave, my son came over alone. That detail matters more now than it did then. He didn't take off his coat. He didn't sit down. He stood near the door, keys in his hand, his body already angled away from me. I asked him if everything was ready. I asked if they were excited. He nodded, but his eyes kept drifting toward the floor. Then he said my name. Mom. There was a pause. Long enough for my chest to tighten. You're not coming, he said. At first, I waited for the rest. A mistake. A booking issue. A reason that could be fixed. Instead, he inhaled and added, "My wife decided you're not family." The sentence didn't make sense. Not right away. It felt like hearing a foreign language spoken in a familiar room. I remember noticing the refrigerator humming, the clock ticking, the way dust floated in the sunlight. Ordinary things anchoring me while something essential slipped away. I asked him to repeat it. He did. I asked him if he agreed. He looked down and said, "She's uncomfortable. She thinks it's better this way." Better for whom, I wanted to ask. Better than honesty. Better than memory. I reminded him that I had paid. I said it calmly, as if facts still mattered. "I know," he said. "We'll deal with that later." Later. As if the money were the only problem. As if the real loss weren't standing right in front of him. That was the moment I understood this was not confusion. It was not a misunderstanding or a fight that could be talked through. This had been discussed. Considered. Decided. And my son had chosen to carry out the decision rather than challenge it. I looked at him and saw someone I barely recognized. A man who had learned how to stay quiet when silence was safer than truth. A man who had chosen harmony over loyalty. I didn't argue. I didn't remind him of the years I worked double shifts. Of the nights I stayed awake worrying so he wouldn't have to. I didn't list what I had given, because I finally understood it wouldn't change the outcome. I nodded. After he left, the house felt too large. Too empty. I stood by the door for a long time, staring at my suitcase. Packed carefully. Patiently. In good faith. I sat down beside it and rested my hand on the handle, feeling the weight of everything I had assumed was secure. That was when it became official. I wasn't just removed from a trip. I wasn't just excluded from a plan. I had been told, clearly and without apology, that I no longer belonged. And something inside me went completely still. I stayed on the floor beside that suitcase far longer than made sense. The house was quiet in the way it gets when no one is expected to arrive. No footsteps. No voices. Just the steady ticking of the clock in the hallway, marking time I suddenly felt detached from. I didn't cry. That surprised me. I had imagined tears, shaking hands, something dramatic. Instead, what came was stillness. A spreading calm that felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious, as if my body had decided to protect me by shutting something down. I rested my palm on the suitcase handle. It was firm, dependable, packed with care. I thought about how much faith had gone into that simple object. How certain I had been that my place was secure enough to prepare for. That certainty was gone. I stood and walked slowly through the house. I passed the bookshelf where my son's childhood photo still sat. His graduation picture. A birthday card he'd written in uneven handwriting. Proof that what we had once been was real, even if it no longer counted. I realized then how much of my identity had been built around being needed. Being available. Being the one who filled gaps without being asked. I had worn that role quietly, proudly, believing it made me indispensable. It hadn't. I made tea and forgot to drink it. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at my hands, noticing how steady they were. I thought about all the moments I had excused. All the times I had softened my own discomfort to keep the peace. All the times I had accepted less because I believed patience would eventually be rewarded. That belief had shaped decades of my life. And now, in this quiet house, it finally dissolved. If I was not considered family, then I was no longer bound by the rules I had followed so carefully. I was not obligated to give without acknowledgement. Not obligated to stay silent to avoid conflict. Not obligated to keep proving my worth to people who had already decided it didn't count. That understanding didn't feel angry. It felt clean. I thought about the money I had sent over the years, the automatic payments, the just this once favors that became habits. I thought about how rarely my needs had entered the conversation. How often my role had been assumed instead of appreciated. This wasn't resentment. It was accounting. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a life that wasn't organized around their convenience. A life where my calendar belonged to me. Where my resources had boundaries. Where my presence was not something to be managed or minimized. I opened my bank app and studied the transactions slowly. I recognized patterns I had once ignored. Recurring transfers. Linked accounts. Permissions I had granted without reconsidering. I closed the app again without touching anything. Not yet. This moment wasn't about action. It was about permission. Permission to stop waiting. Permission to stop explaining. Permission to stop pretending this exclusion was temporary. I looked again at the suitcase by the door. It no longer felt like evidence of humiliation. It felt like a marker. A line between who I had been and who I was about to become. I unpacked it carefully, folding each item and returning it to its place. Not with sadness. Not with anger. With intention. When it was empty, I put the suitcase back in the closet and closed the door. When I sat down again, the house felt different. Quieter, yes, but also clearer. Something had ended. Something I had been carrying without realizing its weight. And in that stillness, I finally understood. I didn't need to be chosen by people who had already let me go. I could choose myself. I didn't act right away. I slept on the understanding for several nights, letting it settle until it no longer felt sharp. I wanted to be sure that what I was about to do came from clarity, not injury. I had spent too many years reacting quietly. This time, I wanted intention. On the fourth morning, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with my notebook. The same one I used for grocery lists and reminders. I wrote down everything I was connected to. Accounts. Payments. Promises that had never been formally discussed but were expected all the same. Seeing it written out was sobering. I wasn't angry. I was methodical. I opened my bank app again, this time with purpose. I reviewed each recurring transfer and authorization. I remembered when I had agreed to them. A moment of need. A reassurance that it was temporary. A belief that support equaled love. I canceled them one by one. No dramatic gestures. No messages sent. No explanations attached. Just clean, legal steps taken calmly, the way you handle paperwork when something has reached its conclusion. I called my financial advisor and asked to remove access that no longer made sense. I updated beneficiaries. I requested written confirmation. My voice stayed steady throughout the call. The woman on the other end didn't know the history. She didn't need to. This was simply business. Next, I reviewed my calendar. The open dates no longer looked lonely. They looked available. I crossed out obligations that were no longer mutual. I didn't replace them yet. I let the space exist. I did not call my son. I did not announce anything. That was important to me. I wasn't making a statement. I was accepting one that had already been delivered. A few days later, the first message came. Casual at first. A question about a payment. A reminder phrased as confusion. I read it once and set the phone down. I did not respond immediately. When I did reply, it was brief and factual. I'm no longer able to provide that support. No apology. No justification. Just truth. There was a pause after that. Longer than usual. Then another message. This one less certain. I recognized the shift. The assumption had cracked. I felt no satisfaction. Only confirmation. More messages followed over the next week. Practical questions. Attempts to soften the conversation. I answered only what required an answer. I did not reopen discussions that had already been closed by their decision. What surprised me most was how quickly the guilt faded. I had expected it to linger, to pull at me the way it always had. Instead, it loosened its grip as soon as I stopped betraying myself. I realized then how much emotional labor I had been carrying without acknowledgement. How often I had prioritized their comfort over my own stability. Removing myself from that role felt less like punishment and more like balance. I didn't scream. I didn't demand recognition. I simply aligned my actions with the truth I had been given. And in doing so, I felt something return to me that I hadn't realized I'd lost. Control. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do when someone has been quietly holding things together. They arrived in pieces, small at first, easy to dismiss, then harder to explain away. The first call came a week after I canceled the recurring transfers. My son didn't greet me the way he used to. There was no warmth, no easing into the conversation. Just a pause, then a careful question. Did something change with the account? I said yes. Another pause followed. I could hear him processing, not my words, but the implications. Then he said, "Our payment didn't go through." There it was. The first crack. Not about feelings. Not about what had been said to me. About a number that hadn't appeared where it was expected. I told him calmly that I was no longer able to provide that support. He didn't argue right away. He sounded surprised, as if support were a natural resource that couldn't run out. But we counted on that, he said, almost to himself. Counted on me, while deciding I wasn't family. Over the next days, messages followed. Short ones at first. Clarifying questions. Then longer ones that tried to soften the situation without addressing its cause. His wife texted me for the first time in months. "Can we talk this through?" she wrote. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." There hadn't. I replied once. Briefly. I'm respecting the boundaries that were set. After that, the tone shifted. They began asking about the cruise. About what portion I had paid. About what I expected back. The word fair appeared more than once, as if fairness had only become important when it applied to them. I asked for documentation. I told them I would review it. I did not rush. That unsettled them. Plans began to wobble. I heard it in my son's voice when he called again, this time trying to sound casual. "We might have to cancel a few excursions," he said. "Things are a little tight." I said I understood. He waited. I could feel it, the pause where he expected me to step in, to smooth it over the way I always had. When I didn't, he cleared his throat and changed the subject. They didn't collapse. That's important to say. They weren't ruined. What they lost wasn't survival, it was ease. Predictability. The quiet assurance that someone else would absorb the shock when plans went wrong. They began reaching out to others. Family members I hadn't heard from in months suddenly checked in. Questions were asked gently, sideways, the way people ask when they don't want to take sides but are curious. "Everything okay with the cruise?" I heard things got complicated. I answered honestly, without drama. "I'm not going. I changed my financial arrangements." Nothing more. Silence followed those answers. Not judgment. Not outrage. Just the uncomfortable pause that comes when a story doesn't match the version people were given. At a family dinner I didn't attend, my absence was noticed. Someone asked why I wasn't there. My son gave a vague answer. His wife laughed it off. But the room didn't move on as quickly as they expected. Later, my sister called me. She didn't accuse. She didn't interrogate. She said, "I didn't realize how much you were helping them." Neither had I, not fully, until I stopped. The cruise itself went ahead, but not as planned. A smaller cabin. Fewer extras. A constant undercurrent of adjustment. I heard fragments afterward, missed reservations, last-minute changes, tension that followed them like a shadow. My son called me once from the ship. The background noise gave him away, music, laughter, an announcement echoing down a corridor. He sounded tired. "Can we put this behind us?" he asked. "Behind what?" I said. He hesitated. "All of it." They wanted relief, not repair. They wanted the old structure restored without restoring my place in it. When I didn't agree, his voice hardened. "You're really doing this?" I answered quietly. "I'm respecting the decision you made." After that, the calls slowed. Messages became infrequent. Practical, not emotional. They had learned that pressure no longer worked. The final consequence wasn't financial. It was relational. They discovered what happens when you remove the person who absorbs inconvenience without complaint. The person who pays quietly. The person who shows up without being asked. They learned that stability doesn't announce itself until it's gone. And while their lives became more complicated, mine became simpler. No emergencies. No sudden requests. No need to translate exclusion into obligation. They hadn't just lost support. They had lost the silence that made everything easier for them. And that loss was something they couldn't charge to an account or fix with a phone call. When the noise finally faded, what remained was space. Not the empty kind that echoes, but a deliberate quiet that allowed me to hear myself again. For the first time in years, my days were no longer shaped by anticipation or interruption. No waiting for calls. No bracing for requests disguised as concern. I began with small changes. I moved my chair closer to the window where the morning light was strongest. I drank my coffee slowly instead of standing at the counter. I noticed how my shoulders rested lower when I wasn't expecting my phone to ring. I didn't announce my new life to anyone. I let it unfold privately. I sold the house the following spring. Not because I had to, but because I wanted something that belonged entirely to me. Fewer rooms. Fewer memories tied to obligation. I chose a smaller place near a park where people walked their dogs at the same hour every morning. Familiar faces. Quiet nods. No explanations required. I donated the furniture that no longer fit. I kept the table where my son once did his homework, but I moved it near the window. It felt right to let it hold something new. I joined a local book group that met on Tuesdays. No one there knew my history. They knew me only as I was now, attentive, thoughtful, unhurried. I volunteered at the library twice a month, shelving books, answering simple questions, contributing without being drained. What surprised me most was how quickly my body responded. I slept better. My appetite returned. I laughed more easily, not because things were suddenly perfect, but because they were finally mine. I stopped checking social media. Not as a statement, just as a relief. I no longer needed updates on lives that had chosen to continue without me. The distance felt clean. Occasionally, my son sent a message. Neutral. Polite. Informational. I responded when necessary, kindly but briefly. We existed now on clear terms, without illusion. There was grief in that, but also honesty. I stopped asking to be included. I stopped explaining my choices. I stopped shrinking to make others comfortable. Instead, I filled my days with things that asked nothing from me but presence. Long walks. Warm bread from the bakery. Evenings with music low and the lights dimmed just the way I liked them. I realized how much energy I had spent maintaining a role that no longer existed. Releasing it felt like setting down a heavy bag I had carried so long I'd forgotten it wasn't part of my body. There was no revenge in this new balance. No triumph. Just dignity restored through alignment. My life began to match my values again: reciprocity, respect, quiet joy. I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need permission. I had chosen myself, not in anger, but in recognition. And in doing so, I found something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. My son chose his wife. That is the truth, plain and unadorned. I have stopped trying to soften it or dress it up as something kinder. He made a choice, and that choice taught me something I had forgotten about myself. For a long time I believed love meant endurance. That if I stayed quiet, stayed useful, stayed available, I would always have a place. I believed forgiveness was owed, no matter the cost. I believed a mother's role was to absorb discomfort so others could live without it. I no longer believe those things. What I understand now is that love without respect becomes erasure. And forgiveness, when demanded instead of earned, is just another way of asking someone to disappear politely. Walking away was not easy. It wasn't dramatic either. It was a series of calm decisions made after the truth had finally settled. I didn't punish anyone. I didn't seek revenge. I simply stopped offering myself where I was no longer wanted. There is grief in that. I won't deny it. Some losses never fully close. But grief is lighter than humiliation. And honesty, even when it hurts, weighs less than pretending. I still love my son. That love didn't vanish. But it changed shape. It learned boundaries. It learned silence. It learned how to exist without self-betrayal. The greatest lesson came quietly, the way the most important ones do. Sometimes love means walking away. Sometimes strength means not forgiving too quickly. And sometimes the family you must choose first is yourself. If this story touched a nerve, you are not alone. You belong here. Subscribe to hear truths where silence becomes strength.